Yakuza Ishin, much like Yakuza Kenzen, it's another spin-off that never came to the West, meaning once again I won't be really reviewing it, but more just giving my experience with it as a non-Japanese speaker. And this one, so far, I'm not gonna say maybe, I'm gonna say for sure the best spin-off in the Yakuza series that I have yet to play, but I would take this with a grain of salt since I have yet to play about half the other spin-offs, that being PSP and PS4 spin-offs. But this game is the PS4 spin-off, being that it was released on the PS3 and PS4. I played the PS3 version because that's what I had access to, and it runs well, but realistically, unless you're in the same situation as me of only having access to the older version, you probably should go for the PS4 version, unless of course you have a PS3 and not a PS4. But speaking of the timing of the release of this game, it's interesting. At a glance, it may seem the circumstances are the same as Kenzen, given it's the first game in a new generation of consoles to maybe test the waters and get the team used to the new platform. And in some ways that's absolutely right, but there's a couple of things here that make it different. First, that it came out both on PS3 and PS4, this being, I believe, because it ran on the Yakuza 5 engine, unlike Kenzen, which had a new engine going into the PS3. And it wasn't just some last effort for the engine like Dead Souls, as this engine did go on to be used in Yakuza 0 and Kiwami. I believe that's because of that this game actually looks really good, which means the first thing I'll be talking about is the graphics. And even though I played the PS3 version, it still looked really good, being very comparable with Yakuza 5. There's just so much more detail in everything, especially character models and faces, which was a big improvement when they changed to the 5 engine. And even with the PS3's less capable hardware, it's still a lot more colorful and vibrant than Kenzen, and with the PS4 of course, it's more like a generational leap. That being said, while it looks great, it's not without its drawbacks, as the PS3 version is prone to slowdowns, which adds even more to the fact that you should play the PS4 version. That being said, I played all the way through the game on the PS3, and these slowdowns only happened a few times and not in a way that made the game unplayable, usually only lasting for a second. Moving on to the story then. This time around taking place 200 years after Kenzen, and it's not really a sequel as the characters of Yakuza once again play different characters based on Japanese historical events. Kenzen had a focus on Musashi, which I had some knowledge of, but here in Ishin it's based on Sakamoto Ryoma, played here by Kazuma's character of course. From what I understand, Ryoma's story is much more of social and political movement than it is about his fighting skills, which contrasts with Musashi's much more personal journey of self-growth. But much like Kenzen, I got all of this from Wikipedia because playing through the story I actually didn't get much of that. But from playing it you can tell that, yeah, a much bigger focus on clans and their confrontations, especially as Kazuma is now part of one of these clans, almost like a Yakuza. By the way, clans might not be the correct term to call these groups, but for the sake of this review and the language barrier, that's what I'm gonna call them. And so, of course, even in Kazuma's clan, there are other notable Yakuza characters, for example, Majima and his brother. And the same goes for outside the clan with Akiyama and notably once again, as in Dead Souls, Ryuji Goda, who I guess is a fan favorite. Which I understand, he is by far one of the most memorable antagonists in the series, if we don't count Majima of course, who was a bit of an antagonist in Yakuza 1. Regardless, Haruka is also here, but not in the main story or the main action of the story, but in the side quest. Some of the side quests are almost unavoidable given how they will appear, much like some other recent Yakuza games where you walk into a triggered event that is happening in a specific area without wanting to sometimes. And sometimes even being unavoidable even if you know they're there, given that they might be between your story mission path. These side quests are definitely a lot more goofy, again much like Yakuza games have now become. Of course, that being said though, I still avoided them, mostly because of the language barrier, as I did not want to get stuck inside one of these side quests, even though here it would be much easier to find a guide given that these missions are numbered. Though this leads me to talk about the actual gameplay, which is by far my favorite part of this entry. Much like Kenzen, Ishin focus on sword combat, but now it's just a huge leap in polish and game feel. For starters, we have 4 styles much like Kenzen, but now these are a bit different. We still have the same single samurai sword, now being a lot better with much better control over what you're doing, a much better combo system with light and heavy attacks, and also a heat action system allowing you to do more moves, including some special moves that you can do at the end of combos by holding some of the attack buttons. These will not have a cutscene, but they do expand heat and will do a lot of damage if they hit, while also being useful to break enemy defenses, making one-to-one combats a lot faster and challenging, but due to that also more engaging. Gone is the breaking block kick, and now the circle button does different things for each method of combat, being that it's basically a special attack for anything but the barehanded, where it's just your usual grab. And to be fair, a lot of these special attacks are in some ways an iteration of the block breaker, in that it can serve as that, but being a lot smoother and not suffering from the very short range, and now also serving as more of a crowd control button, and also being able to integrate it better into the combos. And once again, it helps that this isn't the only way to break an enemy's defense. Another thing that helps is how the movement itself is so much more refined. Again, coming from Yakuza 5, being able to circle around enemies a lot easier with the dodge and the developed combo system. And speaking of that system, as you level up, each style here being able to be leveled up individually as you receive orbs to spend upon each level up. These are white orbs and they can be used in any style of gameplay, but something new here is the colored orbs. These match the color of each style of play, and these are gained by leveling up specific skills. This happens simply by playing with them. And this really helps you play in your preferred way. I personally was very into the main one sword style, and the thing is, even if you max out one skill tree but keep leveling up the skill and use the orbs you gain to substitute the white ones for the colored ones, giving you those white ones to be used again. Meaning that focusing on one style doesn't have to mean leaving other styles underleveled. And this is good, especially as you'll have situations where you will be forced, and if not forced, heavily incentivized to use another style. For example, our next style, hand-to-hand combat, which is forced upon, for example, in this one fight where you're naked. Yes, this is a Yakuza game still. Hand-to-hand here is very similar to 5, but much more focused on one-on-one fighting with more punching attacks over roundhouse kicks. And it makes sense given you wouldn't really pick it in a situation with a lot of enemies, especially given our next 2 fighting styles. Firstly, the gun. Yes, taking place in the 1800s, guns are a lot more developed, and so it also makes sense they would choose it as a main style. And here guns, much like swordplay, are much better as they play a lot like their mainline game counterpart, but more developed. Because they have such a bigger focus here, they even have combos and special attacks. It's hard to put into words, but they managed to turn the gameplay of traditionally melee combat and make it fit the gun. Light and heavy gunshots and ranged shots and short ones, but with wide bursts of shots, and it's honestly very impressive. And it looks really cool. The only problem with the gun is that it uses ammo, which means you have to buy it and keep track of it. Which leads me to talk about the inventory management system, which again, very much like Yakuza 5, where you have a limited space in your inventory, but most things don't go in your main inventory. Stuff like weapons, gear, and the things needed to craft and upgrade those types of items have their own menus and inventories that you don't really need to manage or sort. And you know, it's pretty good. It's better than Yakuza 3 and 4, like I said in my Yakuza 5 review. And now the final and last, and I think in some ways the most important one, because I feel this one is the replacement for the dual wielding of Kanzen, because it's also dual wielding but different, with a sword and a gun, being very fast and also nimble with its dodges, slashing then striking a pose to shoot. It can look almost like a dance. It's very unique, and it's kind of a shame only a handful of enemies even use it, primarily mostly just bosses. It's definitely an all-rounder style with both short and long range at the same time, but of course with the drawback of less damage on both weapons. But its speed and range options are very compelling, and much like the other styles, there's a complete combo system and hit action, and it's insanely flashy and fast. And I was surprised this didn't turn out to be my favorite mode of play. I guess I just really enjoyed the sword play here. Now, to finish this bit off about the gameplay, let's talk a bit about the world. Obviously, grain of salt, since I don't know Japanese, but while it may be smaller than Kanzen in pure area, which I'm not sure if it is or if it isn't, to be fair, so another pinch of salt, but regardless, this one feels much more dense and alive. Every street has people going around about their lives. This was one of the few things I really liked about Kanzen, and in Ishin it does it even better. And now all the stores and buildings are just a lot closer to each other, and it doesn't feel so much like a chore to move around. And like I mentioned before, events and side missions will just be happening around the map for you to stumble onto. For example, I kept stumbling upon this series of side quests where people were dancing weirdly in the middle of the street, which made me think that while I can't read Japanese, that they're going for a more goofy tone that we have seen happen as the series evolves. It really seems, big focus on that word, that this is on par with the mainline games, which I don't think I could say about either Kanzen or Dead Souls. Although minigames are a bit lackluster, it doesn't have as many as your mainline games, it still does have quite a few, and some of them actually share some modern counterparts like fishing, karaoke, and mahjong, but there's also some crazy stuff here like chicken races, which I unfortunately did not dive much into. If I can say a complaint about it, is that there's too many of the rhythm type variety in this one, which to be fair is what we see the most in other Yakuza games, but here it definitely felt like it needed more variety. Now finally, not to finish off in a bad mood, but the soundtrack. It is Yakuza soundtrack. It is a Yakuza soundtrack. What else am I gonna say about it? It is very Yakuza. It just kind of sounds the same. Once again, there's very little infusion of that more traditional sound. And, once again, my opinion is the same. I wish they had gone further with it. Coming to my final conclusion then, as I will not be scoring this game, as I don't feel it would be fair, I'm saying that even with the language barrier, this is my favorite Yakuza spin-off, if we don't count Zero, which I personally don't consider a spin-off. But regardless, it's just a really fun and robust gameplay here, and it feels like a breath of fresh air for the series. And a lot of what makes Yakuza, the silliness, and very importantly, that feeling of the world. Now, addressing my time with it as a non-Japanese speaking person, and honestly, this was easier than Kanzen to play through. The combat is more challenging, but it never throws any roadblocks that would block you from progressing with the story if you can't read Japanese. The worst it ever got, it was just needing to go somewhere and not having a waypoint, which to be fair, Kanzen also never got much harder than that either, with only having a money barrier at one point. In terms of recommendations, I do recommend this game on the PS4 version. The PS3 only if that's your only way to play it. Again, it still plays fine, but it's clearly a PS4 game. Of course, you also have to be aware of the limitations you'll have to face when playing this game. I'm putting this here now and not in Kanzen because I didn't really recommend Kanzen, but you can look up guides on the internet. But also, if you want to play blindly like I did, that's also an option. But again, the guide will get you more of your money's worth. I guess that would be a way to put it. And speaking of availability, this is a game you have to consider creating an Asian Play Store account or even importing it from Japan. Regardless though, I hope this video was informative in some way, meaningful to you, and that it maybe helped you decide if you wanted to dive into this Japanese-only experience. Regardless though, thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe and like and comment and all of those things you can do for free on YouTube. But regardless of that, goodbye.